In 1985, Keith Richards quit the Rolling Stones. The official story blamed creative differences, but something much darker was happening behind closed doors. From secret rehab stays to violent confrontations with Mick Jagger, the real reason for his departure stayed buried until now. This is the untold story of how rock's greatest guitarist almost walked away from it all. Keith Richards was born on December 18, 1943, in Dartford, England. He was an only child, growing up in a small flat with his parents, Doris and Herbert. His father had fought in Normandy during the war and came back with injuries. His mother had a deep love for music and filled their home with records. She played Billie Holiday, Louis Armstrong, and Duke Ellington, and Keith soaked in every note. But music wasn't just something in the background. His grandfather, Gus Dupree, was a jazz musician who traveled the country with his band. Gus saw something in Keith early on and put a guitar in his hands. That moment changed everything. Keith was never one for rules. He started school at Wentworth Primary, where he unknowingly sat in the same classroom as Mick Jagger. But the two lost touch when their families moved. Later, Keith went to Dartford Technical High School, a strict place where he never quite fit in. He got expelled in 1959 for skipping too many classes and ended up at Sidcup Art College. That school was different. It gave him space to be himself. He carried his guitar everywhere, strumming during breaks, playing with anyone who would listen. Then came the moment that set everything in motion. On October 17, 1961, Keith was waiting at Dartford railway station when he saw someone familiar. It was Mick Jagger. He was carrying a stack of records under his arm, and Keith recognized the names: Chuck Berry, Muddy Waters, the same artists Keith had been obsessing over. That was all it took. They started talking, realizing they had the same passion for music. Mick told Keith about his band, Little Boy Blue and the Blue Boys, and soon Keith was joining their jam sessions. Keith's love for the guitar had started long before that. His first instrument wasn't even his own. It belonged to his grandfather Gus, who showed him how to play a Spanish folk song called Malagueña. That one song changed everything. He played it over and over, trying to master every note. At 15, after endless begging, his mother bought him his first guitar. It was a cheap Rossetti acoustic, but to Keith, it was everything. He played it constantly, trying to copy the riffs of Chuck Berry and Scotty Moore, the guitarist behind Elvis Presley's early hits. Keith became obsessed with the blues. He studied every record he could get his hands on, listening to Chuck Berry, Muddy Waters, and Howlin' Wolf. He memorized their solos, trying to capture their sound. Muddy Waters had a raw, emotional style that hit Keith in a way nothing else did. It wasn't just about playing the right notes. It was about feeling every sound. Years later, when asked what shaped his music, Keith said, "If you don't know the blues, there's no point in picking up the guitar." Little Boy Blue and the Blue Boys wasn't a famous band, but it was everything to Keith at the time. They played American blues covers, pouring their hearts into songs by Chuck Berry and Jimmy Reed. Mick started on guitar, but quickly moved to vocals after realizing Keith was miles ahead. They rehearsed in Dick Taylor's house, dreaming about what might come next. That dream started to feel real in April 1962. Mick and Keith went to the Ealing Jazz Club in London and saw Blues Incorporated, a band led by Alexis Korner. Korner was a key figure in the British blues scene, but more importantly, that night introduced them to Brian Jones and Ian Stewart. Within months, Little Boy Blue had faded into the past. Something much bigger was beginning to take shape. The Rolling Stones were coming. Keith Richards and Mick Jagger grew up in the same town, but lost touch over the years. Then one day in October 1961, they ran into each other at a railway station in Dartford. Jagger was carrying records by Chuck Berry and Muddy Waters. Richards, a huge blues fan, noticed them right away. That small moment brought them back together. It also set the stage for something big. At the same time, Brian Jones was in London trying to start a rhythm and blues band. He put an ad in Jazz News looking for musicians. Pianist Ian Stewart responded first, but when Jones played slide guitar at the Ealing Jazz Club, Jagger and Richards took notice. They joined soon after. Jones picked the name Rolling Stones from a Muddy Waters song. He wanted the name to reflect the music they loved. The first lineup didn't last long. Jagger was the singer, Richards and Jones played guitar, Stewart was on piano, Dick Taylor handled bass, and Tony Chapman was on drums. Their first practice was at a small pub called the Bricklayer's Arms. The sound was rough, but the energy was there. Over the next few months, Taylor left, and Bill Wyman joined on bass. He had better equipment, which helped the band a lot. Charlie Watts joined as the drummer soon after. By early 1963, the classic Stones lineup was set. In the beginning, Brian Jones was the leader. He booked gigs, picked songs, and shaped their early sound. But Jagger and Richards had a natural chemistry when it came to songwriting. Over time, they started taking control. That shift caused tension, but it also pushed the band forward. Their music was raw and aggressive. It felt different from everything else at the time. Their first gig happened on July 12, 1962, at London's Marquee Club. They got the spot because Alexis Corner's Blues Incorporated had to cancel their regular show. Jones saw an opportunity and took it. That night, they played as the Rolling Stones and performed blues covers by Muddy Waters, Chuck Berry, and Bo Diddley. It wasn't a packed show, but it was the start of something big. The Marquee Club was known for launching new acts, and the Rolling Stones took full advantage. By early 1963, they had a residency at Richmond's Crawdaddy Club. That gig changed everything. They gained a real following, and industry people started noticing them. Charlie Watts wasn't sure about joining at first. He didn't think a blues band could make money, but once he joined, his drumming became the foundation of their sound. The early shows were wild. The band was unpredictable, rough around the edges, and full of energy. Unlike the Beatles, they weren't polished, but that was part of their appeal. Their first step toward success came in June 1963, when they released their debut single, a Chuck Berry cover called Come On. It reached number 21 on the UK charts. The band didn't love the song, and Keith Richards later admitted they hated playing it live. But it proved they had potential. Their manager, Andrew Loog Oldham, was only 19, but had a vision. He didn't want them to be another clean-cut pop band. He wanted them to be edgy, dangerous, and different from the Beatles. That strategy worked. When Lennon and McCartney gave them a song, I Wanna Be Your Man, it climbed to number 12 on the UK charts. By early 1964, the Rolling Stones EP hit number 1 in the UK. Their debut album followed in April. It was mostly blues covers like Route 66 and I Just Want to Make Love to You, but it captured the raw energy of their live shows. It stayed at number 1 for 12 weeks. At the same time, they kept touring. They played alongside American legends like Bo Diddley and Little Richard. Those shows helped them learn how to work a crowd. In June 1964, they toured America for the first time. The reaction wasn't huge at first. Some shows even had empty seats, but they made the most of it. They visited Chess Records in Chicago and met their blues heroes. That trip changed their perspective. Then, in 1965, everything shifted. I Can't Get No Satisfaction wasn't just a hit. It was a movement. It became their first number 1 in the US and turned them into international rock stars. Through all of this, Brian Jones was still a huge part of their sound. His slide guitar helped define their early music. He was also a multi-instrumentalist. He played sitar on Paint It Black, marimba on Under My Thumb, and dulcimer on Lady Jane. He pushed the band into new creative directions. But by the late 60s, the dynamic had changed. Jagger and Richards were now the driving force. Jones, struggling with substance abuse, became unreliable. In June 1969, he left the band. A month later, he was found dead at 27. Even though he was gone, his impact was undeniable. He was the one who brought them together. He gave them their early sound and helped shape their identity. The Rolling Stones had already become bigger than any one member, but without Brian Jones, they might never have existed in the first place. In 1971, Keith Richards and the Rolling Stones were in serious trouble. Years of bad financial decisions had left them owing huge amounts in taxes. The British government was ready to take everything they had. Instead of staying and losing it all, they made a bold choice. They packed up and left for France. Richards moved to Nice. Mick Jagger went to Paris with his girlfriend, Bianca. The rest of the band spread out across the country. They weren't just running from taxes. They wanted freedom. They needed a place where they could focus on music without anyone breathing down their necks. Richards turned his rented villa, Nelcote, into a recording space. A mobile studio sat outside, ready whenever inspiration hit. The sessions at Nelcote were unpredictable. They worked strange hours, usually starting at night and going until early morning. The house was always full of people. Musicians came and went. Friends dropped by. Graham Parsons showed up often. The energy was wild. There were parties. There were drugs. But in the middle of all that chaos, something incredible happened. Songs like Happy came together in the moment. Richards would start playing, and whoever was around would jump in. Tumbling Dice, Rocks Off, and Shine a Light grew from loose ideas into something real. Some nights, nothing got recorded. Other nights, they captured pure magic. Out of all that madness came Exile on Main Street. It was raw. It was messy. It was alive. A mix of rock, blues, gospel, and country. It sounded like nothing else. After 7 years away from the road, the Stones returned in 1989 with the Steel Wheels Tour. It started in Philadelphia at Veterans Stadium and became one of their biggest tours ever. The band had gone through rough times before this. Internal conflicts and albums that didn't quite connect with fans made people wonder if they were done. But this tour was their way of saying they were far from finished. The Steel Wheels album came out that same year and was a huge success. It hit number 3 in the US and number 2 in the UK. The tour itself was just as massive. The stage design was unlike anything they had done before, built around a giant steel wheel. Every night, they played a mix of classic hits and new songs, proving they could still write music that mattered. By the time the tour wrapped up, it had earned over $260 million. The Stones weren't just back. They were bigger than ever. In 2005, they returned with a bigger bang. This album was different from their recent work. It was stripped down rock and roll, raw and unpolished. Fans loved it. The album climbed to number 3 in the US and number 2 in the UK. Then came the A Bigger Bang Tour, which ran for 2 years and became one of the highest-grossing tours of all time. By this point, the Stones weren't just legends. They were setting new records and showing no signs of stopping. In 2012, they reached a milestone few bands ever have. The Rolling Stones turned 50. To celebrate, they launched a world tour that brought together everything fans loved about them. They played all over the US, Europe, and the UK, filling stadiums like they always had. This tour was about more than just the present. It was about history. Mick Taylor, who played with the band in the early 70s, joined them on stage for songs like Midnight Rambler and Can't You Hear Me Knocking. John Mayer also made a surprise appearance, tearing through Respectable and Newark. The band even released new music, dropping Doom and Gloom and One More Shot. They ended the tour with massive shows at Hyde Park and Glastonbury, proving once again that no one did it better. Keith Richards was as important as ever. He didn't just play guitar, he led the charge, keeping the band's energy alive every night. In 2016, they did something unexpected. Instead of chasing trends, they returned to their roots. They recorded Blue and Lonesome, an album made entirely of blues covers. This wasn't a planned project. They went into the studio in December 2015, started jamming, and 3 days later, they had an album. It was raw, emotional, and full of life. Eric Clapton and Jim Keltner joined them, adding even more authenticity to the sound. The album became an instant success. It hit number 1 in the UK and number 4 in the US. In 2018, it won a Grammy for Best Traditional Blues Album, their first Grammy in 23 years. Keith, a lifelong blues lover, poured everything into it. His guitar work on the album felt like a love letter to the music that had inspired him from the start. But even the biggest rock stars face challenges. In 2019, Mick Jagger had to undergo heart surgery. He had aortic stenosis, a condition that affects blood flow, and needed a transcatheter aortic valve replacement. The No Filter tour was put on hold while he recovered, but just a few months later, he was back on stage. moving like he always had. The Stones picked up right where they left off, proving nothing could slow them down. Even after losing drummer Charlie Watts in 2021, they kept going. Steve Jordan stepped in to play drums, and the No Filter tour continued. The energy was still there. The music still hit just as hard. Keith Richards' life has been a wild ride, and his relationships played a huge part in shaping who he became. One of the most intense and unforgettable chapters of his story was his time with Anita Pallenberg. Anita had already been part of the Rolling Stones world before she and Keith got together. She was with Brian Jones, the band's founder, but their relationship was troubled. In 1967, Keith and Anita became inseparable, and for more than a decade, their lives were a whirlwind of music, love, and destruction. She had a way of bringing out something new in him. She pushed him to be more confident, more fearless, more of a rock star. She wasn't just in the background. She was in the heart of it all, inspiring some of the band's most unforgettable songs. You Got the Silver was written for her, and though many believe Angie was about their daughter Angela, some say Anita played a role in its creation too. She had an energy that drew people in. She was stylish, smart, and completely unpredictable. People called her the First Lady of the Rolling Stones because she was more than just Keith's partner. She was part of the band's world in a way no one else was. She acted in films, influenced their image, and shaped the way Keith saw himself. But their love had a dark side. They both struggled with addiction, and their lives became a dangerous mix of passion and self-destruction. In 1976, they faced an unbearable loss when their infant son, Tara, passed away. The pain was overwhelming. By 1980, the relationship had run its course. Even after everything they went through, Keith never stopped admiring her. He spoke about her for years with deep respect, knowing how much she had shaped his life. After everything that happened with Anita, Keith found something different. In 1979, he met model Patty Hansen, and this time things felt steady. She wasn't part of the chaos. She brought something he had never really known before: peace. They got married in 1983 on his 40th birthday in Baja, Mexico, and from that moment on, his life changed. Patty helped Keith in a way no one else had. He had spent years battling addiction, but she pushed him to get clean. She gave him a life that felt real. They had 2 daughters, Theodora in 1985 and Alexandra in 1986. Both inherited their parents' creative spirit. Theodora became a model and later worked in radio, while Alexandra started as a model before moving into DJing and charity work. Keith Richards' battle with heroin addiction is one of the wildest chapters of his life. It all started in the late 1960s, when he got involved with Anita Pallenberg. She had been with Brian Jones before, but her connection with Richards ran even deeper. They fed off each other's energy, both drawn to danger, both slipping into heroin use. At first, it seemed like a wild ride, an escape from reality. But soon, the drug took control. Richards changed. He was no longer just a quiet musician. He became the ultimate rock and roll outlaw, unpredictable and untouchable. Even at his worst, he never stopped making music. Exile on Main Street and Some Girls were born out of this madness. While his body struggled under the weight of addiction, his creativity kept flowing. But his personal life was in shambles. His relationships were strained. His health was failing. The arrests kept coming. The biggest one happened in 1977 when police found heroin in his Toronto hotel room. The charge was possession for trafficking, a crime that could have put him away for life. That moment changed everything. This wasn't the first time he had been in trouble. In 1967, police raided his estate in Sussex. He and Mick Jagger were both arrested. Jagger for amphetamines, Richards for allowing drugs in his home. The trial turned into a media circus. The judge handed them both prison sentences, but the backlash was massive. Fans and fellow musicians protested. Within days, they were out. The pattern continued. In 1973, Richards was arrested again in London. This time, police found heroin, cannabis, and unlicensed firearms in his house. There were 25 charges against him, but somehow he walked away with just a fine. He always found a way out, but Toronto was different. The authorities weren't letting this one slide. He faced real prison time. He had to make a choice: keep going until he lost everything, or fight to get clean. Detox was brutal. Heroin had been part of his life for so long that quitting felt impossible, but he had no choice. As part of his sentence, he was ordered to perform 2 benefit concerts for the Canadian National Institute for the Blind. In April 1979, he stepped onto the stage in Oshawa, Ontario, with the Rolling Stones and the New Barbarians. It wasn't just a show, it was a statement. He was still standing. Getting clean didn't happen overnight. He had to cut ties with the people and places that kept pulling him back. He focused on music and family. He still slipped now and then, but he never let heroin take over again. In his autobiography, Life, he wrote about those years with brutal honesty. He didn't glorify addiction. He told the truth. It nearly killed him. But heroin wasn't the only thing that left a mark. His years of hard living caught up with him. In 2006, he fell from a palm tree while on vacation in Fiji. He hit his head so hard that doctors had to perform emergency surgery. It was a close call, a reminder that even Keith Richards wasn't indestructible. He started making changes. In 2020, he quit smoking, something no one thought he would ever do. After everything he had put his body through, he was still standing, still playing, still proving everyone wrong. Moreover, Keith Richards' autobiography, Life, is more than a book. It's a window into the mind of a man who helped shape rock music. Published in 2010, the book took 5 years to finish, with journalist James Fox helping Richards put his memories into words. But this isn't just a collection of stories. It's raw and honest, filled with moments of chaos, triumph, and everything in between. Richards takes readers back to his childhood in Dartford, England, where music became his escape. His mother and grandfather introduced him to the sounds that would later define his career. When he discovered blues, everything changed. It wasn't just music to him, it was something deeper, something that would drive him for the rest of his life. That passion led him to form the Rolling Stones with Mick Jagger, but their relationship was never simple. They built the band together, but over the years, their creative energy turned into tension. There were fights, disagreements, and moments when it seemed like they couldn't keep going, but somehow they always did. The book doesn't shy away from the darker parts of Richards's life. His battles with heroin are told without excuses. He describes addiction as both a source of creativity and something that nearly destroyed him. There were arrests, close calls, and years when survival seemed unlikely. But no matter how bad things got, the music never left him. Through all the chaos, he kept playing, writing, and finding a way to move forward. Beyond the drugs and the music, Life also explores Richards' relationships. He writes about Anita Pallenberg, the woman who was by his side during the wildest years, and Patty Hansen, the woman who brought him stability. He talks about being a father, trying to balance life on the road with family, and what it meant to finally find a sense of peace. The book became an instant bestseller, praised for its honesty and the way it captured the spirit of rock and roll. Richards' love for music runs through every part of his life. He doesn't just talk about playing guitar. He explains how he developed his signature sound, the open tunings that made his riffs so distinctive. He takes readers inside the recording process, showing how the Stones' greatest songs came to life. For anyone who wants to understand him, this book is the closest you'll get. His story has also been told through documentaries. Stones in Exile takes fans behind the scenes of the making of Exile on Main Street, one of the most legendary albums in rock history. In the early 70s, the Stones left England to escape high taxes and ended up in a rented villa in France. It was a blur of music, parties, and chaos. The band recorded in the basement, sometimes deep into the night, creating an album that would define their sound. The documentary includes rare footage and interviews with the band, capturing the madness and magic of that time. Then there's Keith Richards, Under the Influence, released in 2015. This film focuses less on the rock star and more on the musician. It follows Richards as he travels to places that shaped his sound: Chicago, Nashville, and New York. He talks about blues legends like Muddy Waters and Chuck Berry, the musicians who inspired him to pick up a guitar. The film captures moments of reflection, showing Richards in the studio with Tom Waits and playing music in Jamaica. Unlike most rock documentaries, this one isn't about excess, it's about passion. The kind that never fades no matter how many years go by. Though Richards isn't known for being heavily involved in charity work, his experiences have shaped the way he sees the world. His bandmate Ronnie Wood has supported addiction recovery programs, helping others who struggle with the same battles the Stones once faced. While Richards hasn't publicly aligned himself with specific causes, his openness about addiction has brought awareness to the reality of substance abuse. Just by sharing his story, he's helped people understand what that life really looks like. His impact on music has been recognized with countless awards. In 1989, the Rolling Stones were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, a moment that cemented their legacy. Richards himself has played a role in honoring other great musicians. In 1987, he inducted Aretha Franklin into the Hall of Fame, delivering a speech that showed just how much he admired her. Over the years, his contributions to music have been celebrated again and again, but he never seems too concerned with the trophies.